In this video, you will learn the step-by-step checklist for a perfect AppsFlyer setup and how to avoid the 3 most common mistakes that I have seen over the past 10 years. So by the end of this video, you can confidently know where your best users are coming from. I have helped more than 100 companies figure out tools like AppsFlyer, and my previous videos on AppsFlyer have thousands of views and happy viewers just like you. Before we dive in, there is a link in the description that you can use to create your AppsFlyer account if you still don't have one and you want to follow along. If you use that link to create your account, you will be supporting the channel. Step number 1, find the link in the video description. Then you'll land on the AppsFlyer homepage and you want to go to the sign up for free at the top. And we're going to start the sign up process by describing our company. We have an app, and I'm going to fast forward through some of these details. We have a little bit more details. We're going to say track mobile app installs. No, search engine. Let's try that. We'll eventually get a chance to choose our password after that lengthy onboarding. And eventually we'll be at the login screen. So log in. If you already have an account, this is where you can join us. Now we're in the onboarding flow inside the app. We're going to get started here. We sign up for AppsFlyer. Now we're going to click the add app button. We can choose the platform that we want to use. In our case, we're going to use just iOS, and this is either available in the store or is pending approval, not published. I'll show you both options. Typically, if it's available in the store, you simply are going to select the App Store URL. So I'm just going to get a URL here of an app that I really like. Once you put the URL, it's going to validate it. So it needs to be public. If it's not, then you can actually go through the pending approval. You choose your country, and then you choose the app ID that Apple will give you once you're in the approval stage. We're going to go with the available in store. Copy that again. It validates. Okay, we can move on. And by the way, if you do Android, it's a similar process where you can do available in store, pending approval, or publish out of store. If it's available in store, again, you do a URL. Otherwise, you have to do the package name for pending approval. And if you publish out of store, then you do the same, the package name, the channel name, and app URL. So let's go back to the iOS. Let's use this URL. And the process will be somewhat similar for the other platforms like Roku, the LG WebOS, like the TV platforms and so forth. Here we get to select currency. In this case, we're going to go with USD. But select the one that makes the most sense to you. And then you have your time zone. By default, it'll be UTC, Universal Time Coordinated Time Zone. I think I got it right this time. In this case, we're actually going to make this PST. Oh, let's look for LA. There we go. That's PST typically. And then we have a note for if your app is directed towards children. This is not. I'm going to add my app. Okay. Now we get a dev key that will be used when we implement the SDK. We're not going to do the SDK yet. We want to do a few steps before we actually get to the SDK implementation. But there's the process to add the app. Now, if you would repeat this for all the apps that need to be added. Get to the implement the SDK portion. You can see there's things like test devices and app events and so on. We're not going to do that yet. I want to go through another step before we get to that. That I think is more important before we actually start writing any code. This will be the structure on which we can then move on to the next step in our implementation checklist. The biggest mistake companies make when setting up AppsFlyer is just simply rushing through all the steps. AppsFlyer is a difficult implementation because there's lots of details, lots of steps. I'll cover a good chunk of them today, but there'll be steps I won't even cover. I never done it myself, and they depend on your use case. But the last thing you want to do is to spend several weeks rushing, you don't get it right, and you have to spend another several weeks just fixing things. The first thing we want to do after we have our account structure set up is to simply go and build a very simple tracking plan or a tracking template. If you've seen other tools, maybe some of my other videos, you have seen this concept with Mixpanel and Amplitude. They can be pretty elaborate and complex. The tracking plans for AppsFlyer are actually not that difficult because you typically don't send as much data to AppsFlyer, and you'll see why in a second. I have this Google Sheets format. If you want to access the same tracking plan, there's actually a link in the description that you can use. And it has a few tabs. You have the events and parameters tabs, which we're going to start. We have some work from one link tagging, a bit of a technical checklist, and then some common data issues and common issues and solutions that I'll cover in a second. In the events and parameters, this is when we try to figure out what kind of events we want to send to AppsFlyer. You will have the install. The AppsFlyer will capture for you when the user actually installs the app. You don't have to worry about that. But it's really helpful to track a few other events alongside the customer journey. Not too many, just a handful. If your app is, let's say, a financial app, it would be helpful to perhaps track when a user starts a trial, when they complete their account, when they become a paid subscriber, and maybe when they get to a specific value moment in your app. Maybe they have to create a budget or they have to connect a bank account, something like that. So you can see those sort of about 4 events. If you have a gaming app, You may have when they complete a specific level, or when they make an in-app purchase, or when they become a subscriber or something like that. So we're only looking for a handful of things. In the plan itself, we're going to have our event name, what we're going to call it. I'm going to show you why we're using this AF prefix in a second. We have the logic of when this event will fire, when the user creates their account or when the user finishes a level. And if we have some event parameters that we may want to pass what level it was, level 1, level 2, whatever that is. And for any payment events or revenue events, we may pass a revenue property capturing the total number of revenue. This is actually particularly important because AppsFlyer will then be able to use that revenue as part of your attribution efforts. It's often common for AppsFlyer to pull in cost data from platforms, let's say how much you're spending on Facebook, and then it can compare that to revenue to give you just quick calculations on return on ad spend. Now, you can use pretty much whatever you want as an event name, but AppsFlyer does have some predefined event names that we may want to stick to. You can see that some of the event names I use, like level achieve, add payment info, add to cart, they already exist as an event name. If you have an action that matches one of these predefined event names, honestly, I would just use them. It will actually give you some pre-built connections later on. When you integrate, let's say, Google Ads or Meta Ads or TikTok Ads, using predefined event names can make that a little easier. If you use custom event names, you have to do a little bit more work later on. And there's also predefined event parameters, as you can see here, like the AF level, which we saw earlier. There was the AF revenue somewhere down here, right there. Honestly, look into your 4 or 5 events, find as many predefined event names as possible and as many predefined event parameters as possible when you build your very simple tracking plan. Now we have a column for notes. I'm keeping this section to say like, hey, anything prefixed with the AF underscore is something special for AppsFlyer, just for developers to know. Then we move on to the SDK itself. We're going to talk about the different SDKs, but in here we can start to note what SDK we care about. I have some pre-built options in the dropdown, and you can tweak this to whatever you want to do. So you may have an iOS Android SDK if you're working with native apps. Maybe you have React Native or Flutter. You may have a backend integration you want to do, particularly useful for revenue events that happen later on, like a subscription started. We may need some kind of backend SDK to do that. You may have TV platforms like Steam or Roku or something else. An event like complete registration, which may happen on multiple platforms, will need to be implemented on multiple SDKs. You just want to make that note. We can have a priority in case we only want to implement 1 or 2 events and then a couple later. Again, because you're only going to implement maybe 5 events at most, you may just do them all at once. And a quick status to know where they are in the development cycle. Let's talk about SDKs for a second before we dive a little bit deeper in the next section. We have our native SDKs, Android and iOS. These are typically the easiest SDKs to work with. The moment you move away from native SDKs, some things don't work as well. Now, I'm not a mobile app developer. You're going to see this later on. Every time I've implemented AppsFlyer, it's about 10, 15 times I've done it with different clients. Then I've always given instructions to developers, and then we kind of work back and forth to get the implementation done correctly. But I notice in many implementations that once we're out from the native world, issues tend to pop up. There's little things that don't seem to work as well. I know some SDKs like Flutter can give you the ability to pull into native options. That may be an option, but just keep that in mind. Now, the other things that are not native are typically called plugins. We may have either Flutter and React Native or Unity, and we have a few other things somewhere like the Unreal Engine plugin. They tend to be very similar to the native, but again, you are bound to run to kind of funky things. You can send data on a server-side fashion, and it's actually just a typical HTTP API post call. We're going to see that a little bit more in a second as well. There is no, let's say, Ruby backend, but you can convert and just send that as a post call into AppsFlyer. We can move on to some of the other tabs in the plan. The next thing is OneLink. Now, OneLink is AppsFlyer's solution for handling different link conditions. That is, if a user clicks on the link, they may be redirected to the App Store on iOS if they're on an iPhone device. But if they're on an Android device, they need to be redirected to the Google Play Store. If they already have the app installed, then they shouldn't be redirected to the App Store. They should just open the app. And perhaps they want to take them to a specific screen in the app. Deep Link is a fantastic technology. Some companies use AppsFlyer just for OneLink, and they actually don't do any of the mobile attribution. The thing we want to do here is get a sense of where we need to put this OneLinks. Now, the way the AppsFlyer pricing works is that you pay per install that is attributed to something that's not organic. For example, if you open the pricing plan here, we can see that the free plan, as of the time of this recording, comes with 12,000 free conversions. That is, these are conversions that are being attributed to some kind of source. Organic conversions are typically free. You can have as many of those as possible. But the moment you use a one link, you just start to tag conversions, installs to some kind of source. And if you pull data from an ad platform, the mobile attribution component, whether that's Meta, Google, or TikTok, those are also paid conversions. If you look at the growth plan, then typically you can see here that conversions are priced at 7 cents per conversion, which means that you may not want to tag every single user who installs your app, dependent on where the user is coming from. Back here in the one link tagging, we can start to figure out, you know what, we may say we do want to tag this homepage buttons that we have that go to the App Store. We have some social media profiles, so we want to tag those links. We are going to have paid landing pages where paid traffic is arriving from Meta or Google. We want to track those there, and we actually need a little bit of a script to do that. And maybe we want to track some of the marketing emails to prospects. But if we send an email to customers and we have a link to the app, we don't want to track those because they're customers already. We don't really care where they came from, and we may just simply pay more for those conversions if for some reason one of those customers doesn't have the app or something, right? I remember once working with a fitness company. They had a web app and a mobile app, and there was a message that encouraged users to download the mobile app, but encouraged customers who already had the web app. In that case, they don't really care where those iOS, Android installs came from because they're coming just from customers. They wouldn't use one links. They'd be okay if all those installs were just simply marked as organic. You're gonna generate the one links later on. I actually have another video completely just on one links, but effectively they kind of look like this, right? So you have your kind of like subdomain. In this case, it's called INH. And then you have the onelink.me. You can't do branded domains here. So you can use your own domain. Many companies tend to buy short versions of their domain and then use them to set it up. I will not be covering that part of the process, but I just want you to know that that is available. Then we have an implementation checklist. I kind of built this. We're actually going to go through a lot of these items today, just of who's doing what. Some tasks can be done by the product team or the marketing team. Some tasks you need developers. This is how I would pass information to a development team. Here's the specific things I need you to do. Here's the links to the relevant documentation and the SDK that we're using, React Native, iOS, Android. And here's any specific notes that you should be aware of. And then as we go through it, we're going to QA things. We're going to make sure that things are working correctly. And then we can start to launch the app. We need this level of specificity, especially when we start to give instructions to developers. If you just tell developers, hey, implement AppsFlyer, here's the SDK, they're bound to miss specific things. We do want to make sure that we're capturing all the little details. This is a helpful tab if you want to track ongoing issues in AppsFlyer. For example, you have discrepancies in your reporting, or the scan integration with iOS doesn't work, or some of the one links are not deep linked to a specific screen. Just build this if you want to use this. If you have like a Jira or something like that, then you can use that instead. Just another option. And then finally, I have this common issues and solutions tab with about 25 common issues I've seen with AppsFlyer. And I tried to put forth what is the actual solution for that, what are some of the next steps to figure out. Again, there's lots of things that can go wrong in the AppsFlyer implementation. It's hard for me to give you everything that could possibly be wrong, but at least I can give you the 25 most common things I have seen that are sometimes easy fixes, or at least here's a very clear step-by-step guide on how to get things working properly. We know to plan things correctly and knowing all the different event parameters, the events you want to track, the specific one links that you need, the specific technical documentation that you'll need, you can then go and actually start tackling the implementation itself. Let's look at that in the next section. Technical details. Now, whenever we deal with developer resource, which I think is honestly one of the most scarce resources in the universe, I really want to be very focused on what I ask them to do, trying to give them as much direction as possible, even if I'm not a developer myself, right? So I give them as many documentation links in a structured format like we saw in that implementation checklist earlier. Let's look at some of the key steps that we want developers to understand. If you have a developer in your team, this is kind of the section you want them to watch. If that's you, then hey, welcome. I want to walk you through some of the things I've seen. You need to forgive my lack of specific mobile app code knowledge. I'll try to guide you through how some things work and how AppsFlyer actually does what it does. First, let's get the basics out of the way. We have to install the SDK, whatever process you use, again, native or not. You then actually need to initialize the SDKs. Let's go somewhere here. You import the dependencies, get this launch. When the app launches, the SDK starts running. The next thing I want to tackle is the idea of customer user IDs. Now, when AppsFlyer initializes in the SDK, you launch the app, it will generate a specific anonymous ID for each user, which is called the AppsFlyer ID. Again, this happens as soon as the SDK initializes, unless you're doing something specific to delay the initialization process. You can also have your own customer user ID. This is typically helpful, but it may not happen until much later on in the customer journey. For example, when the user creates an account, that's when the user may be given a specific user ID, a persistent user ID. And at that moment, you can then pass it into AppsFlyer. So then AppsFlyer will have two user IDs. It will have the AppsFlyer ID, and it'll have the customer user ID that you're passing. This is just a handy thing to do whenever the time is right. And again, you can see some logic here. You associate the customer user ID with the install event, because the install event typically happens much earlier than whenever you pass the customer user ID. Let's talk about the attribution data as well. I'll switch here to my handy whiteboard as I put here some screenshots. AppsFlyer actually has some fantastic screenshots, diagrams of how things work. One of the things that brings people to AppsFlyer is a mobile attribution. You want to know where installs are coming from. The SDK does a bunch of logic for you, and I'll show you exactly what that's going on in a second. I want to talk a little bit about the attribution data. You may have come across something like this, where it simply tells you how to get attribution data with a few different things. So there's a couple APIs here. There's this thing called Data Locker right here, right? And if you can get the conversion data at the SDK level, which is typically down here. The main thing to know here is you don't need to do any of these options if you're just going to report within AppsFlyer itself. The AppsFlyer SDK will capture data, and then in the interface, it will show it to you, and I'll show you a demo app a little later on what that looks like. This is only if you want to take the conversion data and send that somewhere else. The push API, the pull API, and the data locker, I believe, are premium. Yeah, we can see they're actually premium accounts. So you typically need to be on a higher paid plan than even the public plans. The other two are available, but again, this is not necessarily needed to get the conversion data. Sometimes you may want to integrate AppsFlyer with another tool in your stack, like a Braze or Mixon or Amplitude. And AppsFlyer actually has app integrations that can do that for you, which is not even any of these options. Don't get confused by you having to get the conversion data somewhere. Now, just in case you do want it, here's an example of what this looks like. Typically, once the conversion data is available, just here, then you can kind of invoke some kind of function to take the conversion data and send that somewhere else. The conversion data is effectively where the install came from. AppsFlyer has this complex attribution model, and it goes through all of it and then simply says, hey, this install came from organic, or this install came from Facebook ads or Google ads. It is not quite a black box because we can actually see the different data points it is using, but it does happen automatically behind the scenes, and we're simply just trying to feed as many data points as possible, or as many data points as it is possible within your privacy regulations. Let's look at the attribution model next, because this is what trips a lot of people. It's important to understand that AppsFlyer uses multiple methods to attribute installs to know where they came from. It can be described as a waterfall method. It actually kind of looks like this. You can see that it starts with as much as deterministic methods as possible. That is, you should click on this link, so you can attribute it to this source. That would be a deterministic approach, cause and effect. If you're coming from the world of web attribution, you may be familiar with UTMs, right? The UTM source, UTM campaign. You may be very accustomed to a more deterministic approach to attribution, where you're simply saying, if I tag a link with the UTM source of email, I then want to see how many purchases were driven by that specific UTM source. Now, on web, this tends to work relatively okay, even with ad blockers and cookies being deleted. On mobile, though, this is very difficult. You just have to go through an app store, right? So you may have something like this, where a user does something. For example, this is an ad view. They see an ad, then they click the ad, but before they can actually go to the app, they actually have to land here at the app store. So they have to go through this middleman, and then they actually launch the app if they install it. And then you can do in-app events and maybe here's the uninstall. It can be difficult to do deterministic enough. If you're here learning about AppsFlyer, you're broadly familiar with iOS privacy regulations, which were implemented after 14.5. This is now 4 years ago, something like that. Many of the ad platforms, and AppsFlyer included, now have other means that are not just deterministic. So if you go down here, deterministic is great, right? By click or click through or engage view, but it's not going to be as common as you might think, especially when it comes to iOS. Next method is probabilistic. This is where it starts to get much more complex. In this case, AppsFlyer is now trying to weigh all the data and say, what are the odds that Meta drove this install or that Google drove this install? And then we have more deterministic and more probabilistic view through, which is not as impactful as click through. Again, you don't have to get too caught up in the details. AppsFlyer will do this behind the scenes for you. What's important for you to know is that The attribution model uses different data points, uses different methods. The numbers you're seeing are not 100% true in the way you might be thinking of web attribution in particular. I've taken many teams from just web attribution to mobile attribution, and this is one of the biggest hang-up. They really expect the world to be much more simple. I tag a link, I get purchases within some kind of window, 30 days. That's what I care about. That's not what's happening. And the ad platforms, something like Meta, TikTok, and Google, they do not work like this at all. They use a lot of machine learning to try to estimate and determine if an install belongs to them. Now down here, we can see some of the data points that AppsFlyer uses to determine attributions. We have things like the device ID, right? We can see it's deterministic, or the refer. This is primarily on Android, a little bit less on iOS. Oh, see, you can see actually it's not on iOS. Then we start to get into the probabilistic modeling. You see there's no specific IDs here. It's just logic, machine learning, basically. Then we have scan, which is iOS, which is considered deterministic. Apple search has tend to be special too because it's provided by Apple. Deep links. The next thing I want you to understand, because again, you're going to have questions about this, and if you want to do mobile attribution, you have to know some of these details, is the difference between SRNs and not SRNs. So SRN here is simply a self-reporting network. Let me walk you through the two flows. One flow is much easier than the other. This blue flow would be considered a non-SRN. Okay. For a non-SRN, a non-self-reported network, the flow is actually pretty straightforward. A user clicks a link. This is typically a one link. They install the app. If there's the App Store here, of course, right? But they install the app. Then AppsFlyer records the conversion, and then it runs the conversion through the attribution model. And this is honestly as simple as it gets in the world of mobile attribution. User clicks a link, AppsFlyer records that conversion, and then it does the attribution model. And the way AppsFlyer can record the conversion is typically when you click a link, AppsFlyer can actually capture device ID. It can capture device ID if it's available. It might capture IP. It might capture geo data. If this user is on US, California, things like that. So when it sees the install, it can do a comparison and say, oh yeah, this user just clicked the one link 3 minutes ago. The device information is roughly the same. So we think pretty confident that this user belongs to this one link. And then we're going to take it to the attribution modeling, which actually takes into account other factors as well, other channels or sources that may be responsible here. So non-SRNs are nice, actually. It's not too complex. Your issue is that most of the platforms out there that you may care about are SRNs. That is, if we look at the ones here that you should be aware of, is basically Meta, Google, Snapchat. I think TikTok is here. I think Amazon is here, and I think Apple Search is actually here as well. Effectively, all the major ones are SRNs, and you're going to see why in a second. So these are the SRNs. Here's the flow. The user clicks an ad, right, and then they install the app. When the user clicks the ad platform, let's assume this is Meta, they have recorded this, that this user clicked an ad, they install the app, and then AppsFlyer actually pings the SRN. It actually sends a message and says, hey, we received this install, does it belong to you? That's what it's doing with the ping, right? Does this install belong to you? Then the ad platform can go back and look at the click it recorded, and it simply says, oh yeah, I can see that this user with the same sort of device information, geo information, they clicked an ad 3 days ago, and this particular client, their click-through window is 7 days. Then Meta comes back and says, yeah, I'll take credit for that install, and then AppsFlyer records the conversion here. If you're following along, then you can realize that AppsFlyer is going to ping all the SRNs. So if you're running ads across, let's say, Meta, Google, and TikTok, all three platforms may take credit for that install, because maybe it happens within the same window. AppsFlyer may now say, hey, actually this user here has 3 SRNs that are taking credit for it, which is not possible. So we need to then run it through the attribution modeling, and then AppsFlyer would then say, based on last touch and this and that, a bunch of other factors, it will then output one SRN, or maybe not. Maybe it will do some other source, maybe some one link that will then actually take credit for it. This is why you may have discrepancies. Meta may report 1,000 installs, and when AppsFlyer ping Meta, it recorded 1,000 installs for Meta, but then by the time it actually runs through the attribution model in here, it actually got reduced to 800 installs. Can we say that AppsFlyer is a little bit more accurate than Meta? Maybe. AppsFlyer has access to all the data, so it can see all the SRNs and all the non-SRNs, like the one links. And from that perspective, it can then tell you, this is what we think is actually happening from an install perspective. But this is honestly a point of discussion. It can be an issue with some teams. Marketing teams may want to report from Meta because you're gonna get higher numbers naturally. Another team may not. I would say that attribution models are basically opinions. And you're not going to take perhaps the AppsFlyer over Meta. You may use both. But you want to get a sense of the range. If Meta is claiming 1,000 installs and AppsFlyer says actually only 800 installs belong to Meta, that's the range. And what does that mean to our return on ad spend? What does it mean our cost per lead? And from there, you kind of figure out how much budget you should allocate to Meta. This is not science. This is really more art than science. And I want you to know that because mobile attribution is complex. And I see many companies that come in with the wrong expectations. They expect single source of truth. Actually, AppsFlyer has a report called single source of truth, but that's not really what's happening. And then once we introduce scan into the mix, you can see it gets even more complex. I want you to kind of hold some of these ideas lightly because you're not dealing in absolutes. Okay, let's take it a little bit easy now and look at some minor elements here. For example, how you log in-app events. You have a log event method, and then you can pass on the event name and the event properties. Here's the example for the add to wishlist event. And if we're passing on a parameter of content ID and a parameter of price, honestly, pretty straightforward. You want to fire this event whenever the user completes it within the app. Then we have the server-to-server events. So this is where you send an event from your server, maybe a Ruby backend or something like that, into AppsFlyer. And the main thing you want to do here is primarily use this for any conversions that may not be as accurate in the client. Purchases, subscriptions tends to be a fantastic use case for this. You send a request into AppsFlyer. You have the post URL here with your app ID, which may be a number for iOS or the string, the package name for Android. And then you can see here the post request with all the potential values. You're not going to use all of them. The main thing to remember here is that you need the AppsFlyer ID. This is the ID AppsFlyer generates when the app opens and the SDK initializes. This is not the customer user ID. Whenever AppsFlyer generates this ID, you really want to capture it and store it in your backend so you can send backend events into AppsFlyer. I've been on several projects where developers for some reason cannot capture the AppsFlyer ID at the SDK level and then pass it on to backend events, and then we cannot send backend events. I don't know why. Capture your AppsFlyer ID, store it in your product backend, so have it available to send events. Then otherwise, the structure of the payload is actually pretty straightforward, right? We see here the AppsFlyer ID. You may pass the customer user ID if you like, but again, the AppsFlyer ID is required. Then you have event names, maybe event values. You can do currencies, there's parameter, consent data, a few other things that you may or may not pass. If you have the IDFA, for example, you can pass that on. But at the very minimum, the AppsFlyer ID is what actually allows AppsFlyer to connect this data to some existing AppsFlyer user at the SDK level. Something that's handy too is the uninstall measurement. So AppsFlyer can measure uninstalls. You do have to go through a few steps to create the P12 certificate. You see here the specific steps to kind of go through that, pass on the specific IDs and identifiers, and then you upload the certificate to AppsFlyer. As I understand the uninstall measurement, it actually does this through silent push notification. So you'll ping the device with the silent push notification. The user doesn't see it. And then if the notification is not accepted, then the device is considered uninstalled. I believe that's how all the providers do it. So again, it can be just a handful thing to understand how many users are uninstalling your app, and typically it's not a complex setup. You can measure push notifications specifically from re-engagement campaigns, and there are specific instructions here. Typically, there's some work needed to do with OneLink. We're going to see that in a second here. But you can measure the impact of push notifications to then drive reopens or reconversions within the app. Again, you have to kind of go through the steps. It's basically its own little instructions on top of what we're doing here. Let's look at the OneLink. I actually want to show you the flow of OneLinks I was describing earlier. So you have this handy diagram from AppsFlyer again. You can see that as a user clicks on OneLink here, then it goes through a bunch of logic here. Is the app installed? If yes, then we're actually going to look for this universal links on iOS. Android has its own equivalent. If it's no, then we want to go to the App Store. And then when the user opens the app, the SDK initializes. And then we can start to run a few other things. And there's a bunch of other logic here to handle deep links. If you actually go here, we can see that there is a specific setup for both iOS and Android. It's a separate setup. So you have to go through all the steps. If you see the iOS is technically 3 steps, but honestly, every step is a little bit involved. There's some initial app setup. There's usually a couple options that you may use. For iOS, typically it's all universal links ever since iOS 9 or above. And then you kind of follow through the specific instructions to enable the universal links for your iOS app in the App Store. Then you have this unified deep linking logic. Actually, this is the same diagram we were just looking at. And you kind of follow this logic as well. You don't have to use deep linking. Typically, you can set up the one link just to open the app, and it will just open to whatever the first screen in your app is. Deep linking is optional, but if you're going to go through this work, you probably just want to set up the deep linking as you go along. You can see for Android, then the initial app setup uses the app links pretty much since version 6 and above. And again, there's a specific series of steps for Android. Then you have the unified deep linking logic as well. Again, the same sort of diagram, but this is for Android now. So kind of see what that looks like. And then you can enable deep linking through the one link setup. All this happens behind the scenes. The developer needs to go through it properly to enable the one link logic. I won't cover this in detail, but we have those gaming and CTV SDKs, like the TV SDKs like Steam or Unreal or Unity. They kind of function very similar to the AppsFlyer SDKs we've seen so far, but again, this is a little bit out of our scope. One more thing on the one link is if you have web pages that are playing a role before users download an app. For example, sometimes companies will run paid traffic to a landing page on a website, and then the landing page does all like the copy conversion, and then the user clicks a download app, which takes them to the App Store. You can use one link here. The way you do this is the incoming data here actually uses UTMs. This is just standard UTMs. UTM source, UTM campaign, UTM medium. And then you have some logic, this is what the smart script is, that captures those UTMs and simply attaches them to the one link itself. And they click it and they go to the App Store here. Then those UTMs pass through with the one link. Again, there's documentation online for this smart script concept. It's just very simple JavaScript that takes the URL parameters and then attaches them to the existing one link on the page itself. So let's now talk about iOS 14.5 privacy, which basically is any iOS app you have today. You have likely seen the consent boxes that kind of look like this. You can ask the app to track you or not track you. The consent rates here are very low. Last time I saw them, they were about 30%. Actually, I think I saw them a couple of weeks ago and they were about 20% and dropping. You're not going to get a lot of users that are going to do this. When the user says yes, then you get the IDFA, which is a device ID, which helps AppsFlyer with the more deterministic attribution. If the user says no, you don't get the AppsFlyer, and then AppsFlyer has to rely on more probabilistic attribution. Now, however, there's a few things you should set up preparation for this. So go back to documentation here. This is the iOS documentation. So there's a bunch of things. So you do want to set up the ATT. This is what the ask app not to track pop-up is. So you want to go through all the steps to make sure that you are asking users. You can then handle the yes or no conditions. So you see there's a few steps here. You do want to set up this scan post-back copy. So we get the attribution kit post-back copies as well. Those are like the three major steps for iOS that you have to set up. If we go back to my whiteboard, you can see that we have scan. So Apple set up scan when they released this whole ask app to track you or not. This is one of the methods, if you remember, back in our table here, which is one of the things AppsFlyer will use. Apart from those three steps I just mentioned, there is one more step in the interface we have to set up. This is how scan works. The user clicks on an ad, and then they go to the App Store to install the app. We've kind of seen that process. AppsFlyer loads. In this case, AppsFlyer then sends information to Apple, and Apple does attribution for you, and then they determine who the winner of the install is. They send it to the ad network, and they send it to AppsFlyer, and they can view the data in the reporting section. This is a black box. So I will send some data to Apple. Apple will do its magic, and it'll tell you, yeah, this install belongs to Meta. Meta also gets the notice that, hey, the install belongs to you. But remember, the AppsFlyer will simply record it and say, okay, this install belongs to Meta. But when we run the data through the attribution model, we may actually attribute it to someone else. Still get that in play. Stick around for the setup of the what AppsFlyer calls a scan conversion studio. Basically, what happens in this step, there's some logic you can set up here. But this is not the best, if we're being honest. You have to deal with it. Finally, if you do care about user privacy or you have specific regulations, AppsFlyer does offer a few things here. You can see, you can tweak what data gets sent to AppsFlyer. You can anonymize some things. You can handle the install a little bit different from events that happen after the install. And it just varies dependent on the SDK. I won't cover all these details, but again, if you're in the European Union or you have other concerns that you need to be aware of, this section is probably for you. As you add more privacy options to your AppsFlyer data, your attribution will suffer. There's no way around that. We'll have some more limited options, but you may simply be required by law to go through some of these options. This is a lot, as you can imagine. You do have to work with a developer, go back and forth, but if you get a few of the technical details right, in your attribution, your deep linking will work as expected. In the next section, we want to look at how to QA all of this. All right, let's talk about QA. To do a lot of QA when it comes to AppsFlyer. You need to test a lot of things. First, we really want to do some testing at the SDK level. So you can see there's some logic for both iOS and the Android SDKs. You ask your developers to go through all the steps and just make sure that none of the errors at the SDK level are obvious. This is the first kind of level of testing that they should be going through. The next level of testing we want to do is the SDK integration test. And go here in the menu, click settings, and then go down here to the SDK integration test. You have 3 tests: non-organic installs, retargeting, and live events. For non-organic installs, you'll choose your app. You see the app we added. It could be iOS and Android. You have to choose a test device. You can then click the add a test device the first time you do this. And when you add a device, it will ask you for a name. For example, this might be, a Ruben's iPhone. And then it will ask you for some kind of identifier, where the IDFA or the ITV, and then you copy it here. We actually have an app for both iOS and Android that gives you the information. It's called My Device ID. Kind of looks like this. So you can see that when you install the app, you have to consent, and then it'll give you your IDFA or the equivalent on Android. You can copy it and then bring it into the test ID screen here that we saw earlier. But once you have your test device, then you'll be able to go through the non-organic install test. Effectively going to show you a QR code. You scan the QR code, it takes you to the App Store, it installs the app, and then it measures if the non-organic portion is working as expected. If this doesn't validate, you have to go back to the developer to figure out what's going on. Target is somewhat similar. You do a test device, and it'll give you a link. And then live events then simply allows you to see what events are coming through. So if you have an event for account creation or start trial or something like that, you can then run this, and the event should be able to come in within a few minutes. All these 3 tests should validate as expected, unless you have a very specific reason not to. And if any of them do not validate, this is your first clue that you have to go back to the developer and then double check instructions. Did something happen? Is the SDK not initializing correctly? Are we having issues with the plugin versus the native integration? If you have an issue with a plugin, I would definitely try a native integration if you have the option. Now, if you connect ad platforms, you have your own testing to do, like you connect Meta or TikTok. I have another video actually that I'll link in the description that walks you through the process of how you add an ad platform into AppsFlyer. So you'll be able to watch the video. It's another 10, 20 minutes. I don't have time to cover in this single video, otherwise we'll be here for 3 hours. Look at that video, and then typically there's specific testing you do per ad platform. And generally, I always recommend companies to run small campaigns when they're first trying to test things. So be a very small campaign, a few $100s, and then see that all the attribution is working as expected. The data appears in AppsFlyer, and if you're sending any data out to an app platform like Meta or Google, the data also appears there. Next, we have OneLink. Again, I have another video just to walk you through all the OneLink setup that is up a specific link. The 3 tests we're seeing here will help you with some of the OneLink, but you also want to do some validation on that side to make sure that your OneLink logic works. And typically, you want to go through all the potential situations. If you don't have the app, does it take you to the App Store? If you do have the app, does it open the app? If you do have the app and you have deep linking, does it take you to that specific screen? I'm going to go through this, of course, iOS and Android, any other apps, just to make sure that all the specific outcomes are being handled properly. The last thing I want to walk you through is actually just a scan conversion studio. So you actually look at settings and then the scan setup. There's an ability to do a template here. So you choose a template for your app. There's a gaming app or a travel app or a shopping app. You select it, and then it'll ask you to choose like revenue ranges, events, funnels, a few things like that. Again, if you're kind of interested in this, I may make another video just diving deeper into what each of the steps means. Generally, you want to follow along, look at some of the documentation, and then make the best choices based on your app. And this is the data that will get sent to scan, assuming it will set up properly based on those technical details we saw earlier. Lastly, when you get everything right, you'll get something like this. You'll be able to see how many installs are organic versus non-organic. You can see some daily activity users. Whatever events you implemented will be available here. And AppsFlyer will start to show you the different data. Don't stop here though. You can keep learning about AppsFlyer in the next video. My name is Ruben, and I'll see you in the next video.